En el tiempo de Rey Shlomo, en el tiempo del Rey Shlomo, in the time of King Solomon, in Kinneret, by the Sea of Galilee, there lived a poor fisherman who had 7 beautiful daughters. But the daughters were not troubled by their poverty, for all day they would sing romanzas, ballads, to entertain one the other. And all the day they kept singing, all except the youngest daughter Shulamit, who always remained silent. One day her sisters gathered around her, cajoling her, saying this, Hermanas, sisters, look at our young sister Shulamit, who only sits in her corner silent, not singing, while we regale one another in our romanzas. But Shulamit turned to her sisters, and she said to them, Hermanas, my dear sisters, you are wrong, for I am forever singing, but my song can only be heard by the one who longs for a heart that listens, one who longs for a heart that understands. Now every day this poor fisherman, their father, went to the sea with his nets. But every time he returned home, his nets were empty. No matter how early he went to the sea, no matter how hard, how many hours he spent in his fishing, nothing ever came of it. And as he dragged his empty nets home each evening, his neighbors would mutter among themselves, Este está laborando por un culo de pepino. But the fisherman every day, no matter what his neighbors said, would go very early in the morning with his nets, only to return every evening, dragging his nets behind him with nothing that they have caught. One evening, the eldest daughter came before her father, the fisherman, and said this, Baba, Daddy, tomorrow when you go to the sea, before throwing your nets into the water, say this, Estas tratas es por el mazal de la bojora. These nets are for the luck of your firstborn. Do so, and perhaps your nets will catch some fish tomorrow. Well, the next day the fisherman went to the sea and uttered those same words that his eldest daughter told him to say. But when he drew his nets back, he caught nothing but a large stone. And that evening he dragged that stone caught in his nets behind him. And when he walked through the door, he called his eldest daughter and showed her that stone, and he said, This is what your luck has brought me. But then the second eldest daughter came forward, and she said to her father, Baba, tomorrow, before you throw your nets, I want you to cry this, Estas tratas es por el mazal de la segunda. Well, the next morning, the fisherman went to the sea and cried out those words that his second eldest daughter told him to. But what did he catch this time in his nets but cracked clay pots that had been thrown to the bottom of the sea? And he dragged those cracked clay pots back with him in his nets, and as he walked through the door, he called his second eldest daughter, and he said to her, Look what your luck has brought me. And each evening, each daughter in turn said something similar, gave the similar instructions to their father, but all to no avail. And then, on the evening before Friday, the youngest daughter came before her father, the fisherman, and said this, Baba, Daddy, as tomorrow is Viernes, as tomorrow is Friday, before you throw your nets into the water, don't say a word. Be completely silent. Think your thoughts as deeply as you can, and once you have done so, and only then, throw your nets into the water, and let's see what your nets will catch tomorrow." And so the next day, the fisherman did as his youngest daughter Shulamit instructed him to, and he waited and waited. And when he drew his nets from the sea again, what did he see there? A fish all of gold. Each of its scales was a perfect gold leaf, in the middle of which was encrusted a beautiful diamond or ruby or emerald. Its head was covered in pearls, and its eyes were true bright rubies. And it was forever shining, centelleando, so shiny he could barely look upon it. His mouth dropped at such a wonder that his net has caught. But the fish only stared at him with those large ruby eyes and said, "Cavalcare, bring me home and dig a pond in your own garden, and I will live with you." Well, the astonished fisherman brought that goldfish home with him, and at once dug a little pond in his backyard, a japea, a little pool of water, and that is where the golden fish lived. Now each morning before the fisherman went to the sea, he would visit that golden fish in his pond in his backyard. And the fish would peer up from the surface of the water, look at the fisherman with those large ruby eyes, and then would begin to tell him stories, all sorts of stories. But the stories that the fish told the fisherman were all quite strange, for in his stories, the fish never gave names to the characters. He'd always say, "Such and such happened to such and such a person in such and such a place," never specifying any of these things. And the fisherman, morning after morning, heard the same kind of story from his golden fish, until one morning he turned to the fish and he said, "Pescado de oro, my beloved goldfish, you tell me all these stories, and yet I don't know who your stories are about." But the golden fish turned to the fisherman and said this, "Preciado, my dear one, don't you understand that all the stories I ever tell you can be about no one else except you?" Well, the fisherman smiled at these words. And so morning after morning, he continued to listen to these stories and never asked any questions about them from that time forward. But then there came a morning when the fisherman visited his beloved golden fish in the pond in the backyard, and he welcomed the golden fish with a long, sad face. Well, the fish noticed this and turned to the fisherman, and he said, "Preciado, my dear one, normally you greet me in the morning with a smile as I tell you a story, but now this morning you come with a very long face. What is troubling you?" And at this the fisherman sighed. "How can I not be troubled? What am I, after all, but a poor fisherman? And I have 7 unmarried daughters, and not enough money to give them a dowry to find a suitable husband. Why should I not be sad at this?" At these words, the golden fish smiled at the fisherman and said to him, "Preciado, my dear one, is this all that troubles you?" And at once the golden fish began to cough. And every time he coughed, from his mouth came a cluster of rubies, or a cluster of emeralds, or a cluster of diamonds. So before he knew it, the fisherman saw at his feet riches that he had never seen before in all his life. "Well, don't just stand there," said the golden fish. "Collect all these riches at your feet, and go at once to Jerusalem, and there find a jeweler to whom you could sell these jewels to. And once you do so, you will have more than enough for suitable dowry for each of your beautiful daughters." So that is what the fisherman did. He went to Jerusalem, the great city of Jerusalem. And when he arrived there, he had never seen a city so big, with streets so straight going from one end of the city to the other. He walked down one street, and there were all the casaplar, there were all the butchers. And then he turned around another street, and then he saw the shops of all the kundurajelar, all the shops of the cobblers. And then he turned down another street, and down this street were all the shops of those who sold ticheros, those who sold scissors. And then turning down another street, there was the street he was looking for, the street where there was lined all the shops of the bijoutiers, of all the jewelers. And he walked to one of these shops and showed that jeweler all the riches he was carrying in his bag. And the jeweler looked at all these jewels. "My good man," he said, "these are riches I cannot reward you for. I have never seen such perfect jewels in my life. But do not trouble yourself, for I will show these jewels to the king himself, for I am the king's own prized jeweler, and he will find an ample reward for these riches you bring to me today." And so the jeweler went before the great king, El Rey Shlomo, before the great king, King Solomon. And when he was presented with these jewels, even he was amazed. For all the riches he had never seen such rubies, such diamonds of such perfection, so perfectly cut. Where could his jeweler have found such riches? And then the jeweler explained to him that it was a fisherman from Kinneret who had come with these jewels to sell them at his shop. Well, King Solomon was very curious at this story. How could a mere fisherman far away in Kinneret have come upon such riches? And so at once he arranged a travel party the next day to go visit this fisherman in Kinneret. And by the time he had arrived there, the fisherman had already returned home dejected, for he had waited days for that jeweler to get back to him, but he heard no news. But he wasn't in despair for long, for there came a day when there was a knock at the fisherman's door. And when he opened it, how amazed he was to see at his doorstep none other than El Rey Shlomo, none other than the great King Solomon. He was beside himself, but the king smiled at him and said to the fisherman that he wanted to visit his backyard, for he wanted to see where these riches had come from. Perhaps there was a safe somewhere he kept. Well, the fisherman, fumbling for words, explained to the king that there was nothing in his backyard but a pond of water where he kept a golden fish who, after all, had gave him all these riches. Well, this story made the king even more curious. So at once, the king ordered the fisherman to lead him to that pond. And there was the fisherman, and right beside him the great King Solomon. And they waited beside that pond for the golden fish to emerge. And after a while it did. And when the golden fish emerged from the water, it cast its ruby red eyes not on the fisherman, but on King Solomon himself. The golden fish took one look at King Solomon and began to laugh, flopping its little fins. Well, the king was very dismayed at this. Why was this impudent little fish laughing at him, the great King Solomon? And so the king spoke sternly to the golden fish. You laugh too readily, and yet you give no reason for your impudent laughter. And to this the golden fish replied, Your Majesty, how can I not laugh? Look at you. You have all the riches in the world. In your harem you have women, mujeres de todas las sortes. You have women of all kinds. And yet you have the one thing that is only worth having in this world. How could I not laugh at someone like you who has everything, but alas has nothing in the end? And then the golden fish began to laugh again and again. But the king only looked sternly at the golden fish. Very easy for you to laugh at me, and yet you do not even tell me what is the one thing that is worth having among all that I have. And then at that, the fish laughed even louder, flapping its fins. Well, then the king looked more sternly at this golden fish. Impudent fish, why are you laughing now? How can I not laugh? Replied the golden fish. You, the wisest king in the world, and you cannot even answer that question. You do not even know the one thing that's worth having above everything, above all the riches in the world. You do not understand that that one thing that's worth having is a heart that listens, a heart that understands. You who have everything do not have this. And then the king looked down more dejected, for indeed the golden fish had told the truth he was trying to hide from himself for so long. Very well, said the king to the fish. Now you've answered that question. Easy to answer a question, but it's much harder to find a solution. What is the solution to this problem? Well, then the golden fish laughed again. Your Majesty, I cannot stop laughing at all your foolish answers. For don't you understand that the place where you are is the place where you will find the very thing that you want above all others? Don't you understand that in this place you will find the heart that listens, the heart that understands? At first the king did not understand what the golden fish was saying to him. But then he noticed around him that in that backyard had gathered all the fishermen's daughters. And among their daughters, the most beautiful to the king was the youngest daughter, Shulamit. And when he looked into her eyes, he understood that it was her who had the heart that would listen to him, the heart that among all others would understand him more than anyone could. And so he approached the king's youngest daughter, Shulamit, and he said these words to her, words that eventually made their way into the Shir HaShirim, into the Song of Songs, words that went something like this. I have many queens and concubines without number, and still many more young women to please me. But it is you, my beloved, you, my Shulamit, who will be above all these. And so King Solomon married Shulamit, the youngest daughter of the poor fishermen of Kinneret. And his courtiers married Shulamit's 6 other sisters. And prosperity came to the fisherman and his daughters, prosperity that would never leave them until the end of all their days. Y ellas tengan bien, y nosotros también. And so they lived happily, and may it be the same for us.